Abdul Wahab Al-Kipsi. My friends call me Abdu. I'm the Deputy Director for Programs here at CIPE, the Center for International Private Enterprise. And CIPE is one of the core institutes of the National Endowment for Democracy, and we're also a nonprofit affiliate of the US Chamber of Commerce, which gives us an interesting take on what we do. We strengthen democracy around the world, but we do it through the private enterprise and market-oriented reforms. And the way we do that is through 4 areas of strength. The first one is democratic governance. And for us, democratic governance, democracy, is what happens in between elections. Elections are absolutely important. Without them, you don't have a democracy. But what happens in between elections is very important to give a voice to the citizens. But in addition to all of that, we develop enterprise ecosystems to give a chance for people to succeed in life. And it's not just about elections and freedoms, which are, again, very important, but to give the people a chance to succeed in life. And not just through the enterprise of the infrastructure of an enterprise, accelerators, incubators, but also to build the institutions that lower the barriers for entry, develop rule of law. These are all important to go into business, stay in business, and then exit from business. We also work in anti-corruption and ethics, and we work on that from the public sector and the private sector, both sides, transparency, accountability. And finally, we do all of this through advocacy, working with business associations, chambers of commerce, think tanks, to make sure that, again, private sector is not corrupt, public sector is not corrupt. We added a new area of strength, trade facilitation. I see Morgan and some members of the trade facilitation team. It's not just about the volume of trade. It's about how deep that trade is. It's about the voices of the local businesses. It's about small and medium enterprises to have an opportunity to succeed and to benefit from that trade. I can go on and on. I decided to just telegraphically tell you what we do because we have a very important session today to talk about Sri Lanka. And let me start by thanking Jenny, first of all, the soldier who made all of this work. And of course, Julie from our communications department. Thank you very much for a wonderful event. Thank you for this, for organizing it. And I thank Jenny and Mark, who runs our Europe, Eurasia, and Asia departments, both of them who took me to Sri Lanka in May. And I've traveled a lot of countries for CIPE, and some countries you actually fall in love with. And I fell in love with Sri Lanka, I confess. It's a wonderful, wonderful country. I met Nishan, who gave me the intellectual nourishment I needed. He also took me to nice food places, and people at CIPE know I'm a foodie. I truly enjoyed probably the best crab I've ever had in my life. But you see a country that is coming along. You see a country that has kept its tradition, but also is serious about development. You see a industrial base, manufacturing base that can take the country forward. You see a country that is moving through an economic and political reform agenda that will realize the potential of the Sri Lankan people. But you also fear that things are happening. Is that agenda moving forward? If not, what's keeping it behind? If so, how can we put it back on track? And this is the discussion today. Expectations are high. How can we meet these expectations? And to moderate this session, we are really, really fortunate to have the very accomplished Dr. Kiran Pervez, who I hear from Jenny and from others that she has a style that keeps the conversation flowing. She expands the discussion, but keeps it on track. So that's what we hope to get today. Dr. Kiran, for us, has a PhD in international relations from the American University School of International Service. Confession, disclosure, that's my alma mater. She's the chair of South and Central Asia Area Studies at the Foreign Service Institute. And interestingly enough, I can't wait for her next book, which she's working on right now, that explores the interaction between national identity, religious resurgence, Islam, and extremism in contemporary Pakistan. So I can't wait for that book, and I can't wait for the discussion. Dr. Kiran.
Yeah. Abdul, thank you so much for that generous introduction. And Jenny, always thanks for inviting me. Before we go into anything, we still have a few chairs up front.
Yes.
If there are any courageous people.
So if I can invite
like
Professor Kirawala to come and join Ambassador Subasinghe up front. And I think I saw Dr. Chris Rodrigo also walking in. If you can, there are seats up here, if you can join, please. And is there anyone else that would like to take the last seat at the table?
One more.
Can we get a brave woman to come join us? No.
Yeah,
Oh, come on, yes.
All right, yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to go all gender like 1 minute into this, but that's true. Boy, girl, boy, girl. Okay. Folks, thank you again for coming on what is not a very cold but still rainy afternoon, right? So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce. I will not talk too long. I'm going to go over to the real brains of this event. Ms. Miriam Young, who is director of the U.S. Council on Sri Lanka, which is a DC-based advocacy group, and she is also U.S. director of the International Working Group on Sri Lanka. Miriam has done a lot of really good work. She's worked for 2 decades with commitment to promote peace, justice, and reconciliation in Sri Lanka. She's had a long and diverse human rights career. Wow. Very long and diverse human rights career, right? But just a couple of things that I want to highlight because she's well published, she's done a lot of research, she's spoken publicly, but she's worked very closely with Asian diaspora communities. She's also served as a consultant on participatory democracy programs and participated in election monitoring delegations to Indonesia, Cambodia, East Timor, and Sri Lanka. So it's wonderful to have you here and for us to benefit from what you have to share with us. And Ms. Young also holds a master's in international affairs from Columbia School of International and Public Affairs and a BA from Wellesley College. So Miriam, thanks. We're looking forward to hearing from you shortly. And Dr. Nishan Dimel, who is here with us from Sri Lanka. And he's the executive director and head of research of Verite Research, which is a think tank that provides analytical research and advisory services on economic, political, and legal issues in Sri Lanka and Asia. He does everything and everywhere. I think that's the basic thing. But by training, Nishan is an economist with extensive academic, policy, and private sector experience. I was really intrigued when I was reading this part of your bio, so I'm going to share it with everyone in case you haven't seen it. He's been a member of the Presidential Task Force on Health Sector Reform, Presidential Committee on Tobacco, Alcohol, and Dangerous Drug Regulation, and the National Steering Committee on Social Security. So no difficult issues, just through and through. He's also been the executive director of the International Center for Ethnic Studies, and he's been on the board of the Sri Lanka Foundation Institute. Internationally, Nishan has held several governing, teaching, and research positions, including lecturer in economics at Oxford University. And he earned his master's and doctoral degrees in economics at the University of Oxford, where he was also a Chevening Scholar. Yay. And an undergraduate degree in economics from Harvard. So welcome to you both. We're going to, I will stay true to my reputation. We will keep this conversational and interactive. So what we thought we would do is maybe start with a few opening remarks of about 5 to 7 minutes each from Nishan and Miriam. I just want to highlight one thing. You probably see index cards placed close to you. If during the first few minutes of the discussion, as Nishan and Miriam are sharing their remarks, if you have a question that's absolutely burning, if you could write it down and just wave your hand so someone can collect it and bring it up front, and then we'll launch into our discussion with your questions, or interject, or however that question seems to present itself. Otherwise, we will definitely have a lot of time for interaction and questions right afterward. But we're looking forward to a robust, we were talking about this yesterday, and we've got, between Nishan and Miriam, we've got some overlaps, we've got some divergences, so we'll get into all of that. This will not be like a new style panel, but the idea is to really spend some time unpacking issues instead of just getting into superficial details. So welcome everyone, and Nishan, maybe we can start with you.
Sure, thank you, Kiran. Thank you also to Saip and Abdul and Jenny for inviting us. I think it's really privileged to be able to share sort of thoughts across the continent. I do this kind of discussions in Sri Lanka quite often, but you're a very different audience with probably very different questions. So feel free to probe and disagree and move me in a different direction if what I present isn't exactly what you're thinking about or asking for. Because Kiran suggested that we start with some opening remarks, and I'm speaking first, just to lay the context. We've presented this event as looking at the democratic transition. So looking at, I think the conversation really on that transition starts in 2009, where the war between the government and the Tamil Tigers came to an end. And there was a question about, the war has ended, but, what about the peace? I think we described the problem in terms of, there is a peace, of course, when war ends, but I use the term negative peace to describe that, right? So negative peace as in the absence of war, the absence of conflict or fighting. But the challenge, I think, that we all looked at was the challenge of building a positive peace, a real sense of belonging, reconciliation, rapprochement, that the ethnic communities had put behind the kind of enmities that developed, that existed both as a cause of the conflict, but also developed as a consequence of the conflict. And I think one aspect of the democratic transition comes up in the problem of building peace. But I want to broaden the problem of peace, because if we ask what were the major complaints that people had with regard to the functioning of the government 2009 to 2014, and I will divide that into two aspects. One is the functioning of state power. How did state power function in Sri Lanka? And there were two features that were worked against sort of democratic interests. One was the strong centralization of state power, and the other was the ethno-religious hegemony that came to be defined or caught up within the state. So the functioning of the state was one aspect, and the centralization and the ethno-religious hegemony were two particularly important issues, I think, within that. The second issue, I think, for democracy was the deinstitutionalization, or how institutions were functioning in Sri Lanka. And there you saw, again, if I say two aspects to the institutional problem, one was the corruption and the criminality that was being less and less checked by institutions. And also the way that institutions functioned as instruments of suppression. Suppression of dissent, suppression of people that were not part of the political establishment. Now, none of these things that I'm talking about are new in Sri Lanka or unique to the government that existed between 2009 and 2015. In fact, I would say all these features were a part and parcel of Sri Lankan government, state, and institutions ever since independence. It's just that, I think between 2010 and 2014, there was an acute awareness of how this problem was re-emerging. And the campaign for change or good governance, Yaha Palane was the Sinhala word, emerged as politically developing a resistance to these habits that had existed over a long time and arguably increased significantly over that period as well. Now, if I were to say, without unpacking it for the moment, just to signal it and have Kiran drive the conversation later, where the change in government has been most successful and least successful, I would say they have been most successful in addressing the centralization and ethno-religious hegemony of the state. Some of you are going to immediately argue with my second point, but let's put it this way, that the jackboot of ethno-religious hegemony that existed from 2009 to 14, the foot of the state was removed from that jackboot. So that was a significant shift. I'm not arguing that all the problems of the minorities were solved, but certainly the sense of oppressive state managed or state-sanctioned ethno-religious hegemony, that came off. Okay? And I would say that is the greatest felt success The greatest felt failure, I think, is on the second aspect, on the institutional side, that corruption and criminality, that the institutions that can address corruption and criminality have not been put in place in a way that was expected. That there's a tendency, even civil society and the international community and others looking at the government, to mistake good guys, in their view, for good governance. Right? The structures of these institutions are not entrenched in a way that they are independent of political discretion. And we can't really talk about having restored good governance simply because the way in which those institutions are used may be less to our dislike than before. Okay? Even if and there's lots of examples in this, in terms of the way the laws are being changed and done, that point to that this being the greatest area of failure, not just now but continuing. Let me shift to one more aspect and close my remarks with that, which is to describe the nature of government that we have in the country after 2015. It's a very unique situation because for the first time we have a coalition between the two major parties, the SLFP and the UMP. So Sri Lanka is no stranger to coalition politics, but this is the first time that the SLFP and UMP have formed an enduring coalition in government. It has also created two executive positions with the 19th Amendment to the Constitution that are almost equally powerful. Okay, and I can get into the legality of that later, but it means that we have effectively, for the first time, a two-headed government, where the two executives have to agree to take things forward. And there is both a need for cooperation, because that is the only way you can move forward, but also an imperative for competition, because looking at the next election, the SLFP and UMP don't plan to campaign together to win the election. They plan to campaign separately. The general election was also a separate campaign. So a two-headed government with an inbuilt structure or imperative for both cooperation and competition creates a unique set of dynamics. It means, on the one hand, there's limited space for, there's limited, and on the positive side, there's limited divergence. Right? And that's something a lot of people ask about. Limited divergence simply because the government knows, as who was the American president who said, if you don't hang together, you will hang separately. Right? So when it comes to critical issues, a no confidence motion against the finance minister, Padayatra against the president, the government, the two sides of the government come together, they hang together because there's an imperative for cooperation. But on the negative side, there's also limited, there's limited convergence. So when they come together on policy, it often is, the timing is the timing is poor. They don't agree at the same time, and the process of agreement looks quite messy. Okay. If I can end on the positive note of this messy convergence and limited divergence. It's that the competition within the executive that effectively exists in Sri Lanka means that there is a greater space for public concerns to be taken more seriously. So we have effectively a government that listens and responds better. Because the competition to win public support, to legitimize yourself, is stronger when two executives of two different parties are competing at the heart of government. It's like the Magna Carta. It's when government feels weak, when the king feels weak, that he is forced to listen to his nobles or to the people. And if you know what happens with the Magna Carta, soon after it's signed, the king writes to the Pope and says, let's abrogate it. I'm feeling more powerful now. When the Magna Carta is abrogated, a year later, somehow both the king and the Pope pass away within that year after that, and the next king is a child king. And his advisors realize that the only way to gain support for this child king is to reissue the Magna Carta. And so the Magna Carta is, of course, reissued many times over the history of British politics until it's entrenched in parliament. So I think the fact that neither executive feels strong enough on their own creates that dynamic of responsiveness and space for publicly politicized concerns to make a difference in Sri Lanka, which is, of course, speaking from a perspective of democracy, a rather positive shift that has emerged, not because necessarily the leaders have large democratic sentiments that are very different from the past, but because the structure of leadership and government at the moment has also created that positive imperative. So let me stop there as laying just a foundation for our conversation and pass it back to you.
So I wrote extensively, and I hope you guys are too with questions and ideas. But Miriam, maybe we can get some remarks from you and then dive in whole and soul.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I would also like to extend my thanks to SITE for inviting me here and to next to my colleague, I guess, Nishan, I could call him, and it's really an honor. So sorry about that. I'm just going to lay out a little bit where some of the issues that I tend to see as very critical to the democratic process in the country, and just to kind of establish a little bit where we are. We are almost exactly 2 years from the presidential election, which defeated an increasingly authoritarian regime and was seen really as a landmark event in Sri Lanka. We're a little more than a year following the ensuing parliamentary elections, which to some extent kind of consolidated the new government. We're 7.5 years from the end of the war. And I would say that the results of the election were not an indication that democracy has returned, but they removed a major obstacle to democratic reform. They allowed for a process to develop and to try to rebuild some of the institutions that had really increasingly been broken down. So I think one thing that is sometimes has been misread by perhaps observers of Sri Lanka is that Sri Lanka really was a very well-functioning democracy, and it was an aberration, this period under the previous regime, that now that we've removed that now it's a democracy again, and everything is already there. I don't think that was correct. So I think it was very fragile at the time that the Sri Lankan people who banded together, essentially, many of them with different hopes and different issues that matter to them, but for them it was key to vote out the previous regime. Another thing that happened as a result was that it opened a window or a possibility for an honest accounting of the war, and the possibility for a real reconciliation and a healing through a very careful process, which had simply not been possible before. And I would say that I guess the most positive reading that I would put on it is that it is unclear how far this government is willing to go to tackle some of the very hardest reforms and issues related to coming out of that war mentality and that war situation. And now, as I say, 7.5 years since the end of the war, 2 years after the change in government, and some of the toughest issues have really not been dealt with. It doesn't mean that there has not been progress. There has, and I think many observers are very quick to point out the indications of progress. But there are other things that I think could give one a great deal of caution. So a little over a year ago, in a really landmark resolution at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, the Sri Lankan government jointly sponsored a resolution which committed itself to a very careful process of transitional justice following the end of the war. This was really a high point. It was something that followed 3 fairly punitive resolutions that obviously the government was not happy about at all and did not join. But this was something that the government agreed to and committed itself to for the government and for its own people. And just read a tiny bit that they committed to a comprehensive approach to dealing with the past through mechanisms and processes to ensure truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence. Moreover, the government also committed to a victim-centered approach, promising broad national consultations with the inclusion of victims and civil society, including non-governmental organizations from all affected communities, to essentially inform the design of this process. So it was kind of like a clean slate and great opportunity for the future. And what I would say at this point is that the progress has been kind of piecemeal and ad hoc, with perhaps a step forward and some serious steps backward. And whereas we want to applaud the progress, and coming out of a 27-year brutal civil war is a huge task. It is not something anybody can sort of diminish how difficult that is. And it will take a long time. However, it needs to move forward, and there needs to be trust from the government's population that the government is sincere in order for that process to work. So far, out of the 4 pieces of this process, only one has actually come anywhere close to being established, and that's the Office of Missing Persons. It is not up and running. It doesn't even have the people who are going to run it, and there were many problems with it. One of them being that despite the commitment of the government to have a very transparent process and discussion with the victims and society, in fact, it was designed pretty much separately and then presented with very little opportunities for input. One hopes that the mechanisms that are coming in the future will not be done in that manner, because there was quite a lot of criticism from civil society about the way in which that was done. The other, really one of the key pieces that was included in the resolution, and it's, I think, something very essential to a democracy, is the law that Sri Lanka has on the books, the PTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which allowed for great abuses of power by the security forces, and which in that resolution the government committed itself to replace with a legislation that would be up to international standards. And what has happened is that there has been legislation now put forward which is in fact actually worse than the current PTA. And that's, I think, something that is cause for great concern, also just for the country's sake, because in order to get something they want very much, which is their trade privileges back with the EU, that is a sticking point, that legislation. And then I would, finally, I would just say that something which has come back, and this is where I would disagree with my esteemed colleague, something which seems to have returned is a kind of very extreme religious intolerance from some fundamentalist Buddhist groups, the BBS, as it's known, which has often been compared in ways to the Burmese group. It is not the same, but there are certain similarities. And in recent weeks, we've seen some very public, broad marches from members of this group, extremely violent and virulent hate speech against Tamils and particularly Muslims. There have been over 100 incidents, both against Christians and against Muslims, just in this year that have been recorded. And we need to see a very strong reaction from the government's leaders against this, that this will not be tolerated, and we are not seeing that at all. So I think that's something to be very concerned with, because it had not gone away, but it had died down under the new government. So there's other points, but I know I've gone on, so I'll stop and leave the rest for discussion.
Well, and I don't know about you all, but I literally started writing down things, and I'm like, okay. So first of all, both, thank you so much for getting us started with thinking about things more broadly. And I'm going to just do one little tiny sort of bookkeeping announcement is, whatever I'm asking and anything I say is in my personal capacity as someone who studies South Asia. I do not represent the views of the US government. I forgot to say that in the beginning. I didn't say anything. Well, my introductions could be on behalf of the US government. That one's fine. I want to try and intertwine some of the things that you just said, and I'll start with the first one. Nishan, I was intrigued by what you, and we've been hearing this a lot, right? We've been hearing this for decades, but just this idea of peace being something that's not just procedural, but that it's something much more meaningful, that it's positive. So in some respects, I think that the unity government in Sri Lanka right now represents, like you outlined, a unique opportunity for ethnic reconciliation and for unifying the country. And it's met with success in terms of democratic reforms, but not so much, I guess, as you outlined in terms of institutionalization. So I guess, I mean, I'd like to know from you, just given the uniqueness of the structure that you laid out, and given the sort of constitutional reform process that's definitely in front of the government, how do you kind of see this working out? Where do you see, I guess, what role do you see, to what extent is there a consciousness of peace building that's much more aligned? Maybe you could outline for us what you think that positive peace building process would look like for Sri Lanka. And then given where we have institutions, what that might look like in terms of being implemented. I think, just like you pointed out, it's probably going to be a messy process to begin with, and it's going to be a step forward, 2 steps back. I think that's inevitable. And I think, Miriam, just kind of building off of that question, I also want to know from you what, given sort of Nishan's point that, I mean, we have a lack of institutions. I think you kind of alluded to it, given in terms of how you characterize democracy in Sri Lanka. I guess for you, what would healing look like in this context? So, whichever one.
Should I? I'll start by addressing Miriam's question where she disagrees with me. So Miriam, of course, the recent resurgence of religious kind of extremist groups is a very serious issue. I think my point was that the foot of the state is not in that checkbook. So the big difference between then and now is that the state is not sponsoring or sanctioning or being evidently to be fostering those groups. And I think the impunity of those groups in the past was what made them especially vicious. They are vicious even now. And the non-action against those groups today is not a problem of state or political favor, but of institutional, chronic institutional illness. The problem of religious violence in Sri Lanka isn't limited to these, media kind of spectacles that happen occasionally with Bodu Balasena and groups like that. It's been going on for the last 50 years. We've done studies on religious violence, on burning of churches. So while the attacks against Muslims are quite new, attacks against Christians are decades old. And Christian churches have been burnt, pastors have been attacked since the 80s. And in our studies, and we analyzed both the frequency, the kind of probabilities of those emerging based on demographics, and also the way the courts have dealt with it and the way the police have dealt with it. What we found consistently was the way the police, in a sense, was part of the problem. The way the police treated it as civil disturbances, neighborhood problems, and always acted in a way that was biased against the religious minorities. And the way the courts also refused to classify them or prosecute them as religious violence, but some kind of neighborhood conflict or some destruction of property in some other category, which makes it very hard to follow even the judicial processes against those. So we have a chronic institutionalized problem entrenched in the police and the law and order system in the country with dealing with religious violence, and I think it's an institutional problem. The state actually cooperating, sanctioning, and being also an enabler was a much more aggravating problem, which is the problem that's been reversed, but the institutional problem has not been fixed. I think that perhaps the greatest danger we are facing in terms of human rights activists, the international community, all the people who are well-meaning about the reconciliation and peace-building process in Sri Lanka, is that they don't see the connection between peace-building or fixing the structure of the state and fixing institutions. A significant part of the cause of the ethnic problem is also the way institutions function towards communities, the sense of discrimination, and even if it's not discrimination, just plain ill treatment. I mean, if you're poor and you walk into the police, you get treated very differently than if you're rich and you walk into the police. If you're Tamil and you walk into the police, you have less room to get things done. A Tamil friend of mine was in a small car accident recently, and we were at technically the most prestigious police station in Colombo, and nobody could function in Tamil. And I had to sit and translate everything and put my name down. And these are chronic problems that could easily have been solved for decades. Could have been solved last year, the year before, but there is no, and not fixing them is a significant part of the ethnic problem, because you can't simply say, let's change a constitution and change a set of laws and we will bring reconciliation to people, because people have lost the ability to trust that laws will even be implemented. So if you can't trust that a new constitution, that what's on paper may not bear out in reality, what are your chances of changing a constitution and bringing reconciliation and peace? But if you don't have that chance, actually you don't have a chance, or not very much of a chance. Because whatever you do, ultimately people must be able to trust that it's going to get borne out in reality if you're not going to completely separate and live out a separate existence. So you have a 13th Amendment to the Constitution that's not fully implemented. So now you promise a 20th Amendment or a new Constitution. It makes a big difference if you can trust that your institutions do what they're supposed to do. And ignoring the governance aspect, I think, is actually inimical to the peace-building challenge that we are facing. And that is something that we really have to take more seriously. So shall I? Please.
No. So I'm intrigued by what you said, because I think what you're saying about trust goes back in some respects to what I asked Miriam about slightly earlier, is you have to have some element of healing to have that kind of trust present to build institutions to begin with, right? Which is not the direction I was taking my question in earlier, but I couldn't help notice that it sort of connects to that. I'm gonna add one more sort of thought to your trust point, and maybe you want to sort of respond to that and we can move on to Miriam, is, like, this is one of the things that I grapple with. And when I think of South Asia writ large, we've seen a sort of increased commitment to democratization at the same time, and this isn't unique to South Asia by any stretch of the imagination, but we've seen also the rise of, I mean, and again, that has a lot to do with changes in media environments and people's access to having more of sort of a public platform. But we've seen extremist groups being able to speak out a lot more and feel like they're more engaged. They probably were before, but their platform was completely different, right? So, but the one thing that I struggle with is it's very easy. I mean, and we do this, and as an international relations scholar, I would say we're perennially guilty of this, is we think about the state when we think about sort of democratic reform, et cetera, but the state doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in relationship with that civil society. So I guess maybe I want to push back and say, where do you think, I mean, do you think that just people writ large are, there's clearly an issue of trust, but are they also, in what ways are they committed to sort of moving Sri Lanka forward on that democratic path and to building a Sri Lanka that they would like to see?
So if I can bring closer to what I was saying, and that's a good question to do that. You know, these kinds of social, public kind of upheavals, events that change governments, don't come all the time. It takes a lot of suppressed discontent to kind of blow out, you know, in a mini volcano and change a government that looks very entrenched. Yet, what we learn from everywhere else in the world, and Kiran will know this better than I do, is that these kinds of movements get political change, but they don't guarantee that that change will get entrenched in the systems of government in that country. When they don't get entrenched, you actually cycle back over maybe a 10 to 15-year cycle and have to do another one of these upheaval moments and democratic revolution moments to redo the change. I mean, Sri Lanka is, I mean, you can talk about Brazil, Ukraine, et cetera, but Sri Lanka itself is a classic example. In 1994, you had a change of government after a long period of time, after 17 years of UMP rule, the slogans of which were Dushanaya, Bhishanaya, which is corruption and suppression, which were precisely the slogans of the 2015 change as well, but now against the other side, right? And the UMP claiming to be the arbiters of good governance. And it was against good governance, which was against Dushanaya and Bhishanaya and criminality. So the question is, that change that happened in 2015, has it changed the trajectory of Sri Lankan politics? Or have we just moved to a different part of the cycle? And are we going to repeat that cycle again, where, you know, 10 years later, you have to come back and do something else? That's very difficult. And people get tired of it. People get cynical. And you can see a Sri Lankan polity that is already cynical and feel that, you know, there's no point, you know, fighting these politicians and getting them to be not corrupt. Why don't I join them? And you know, most cartoons in Sri Lanka show the common man, Citizen Silva, we call him, right? Not John Doe, but Citizen Silva. You know, as a skeletal figure, he has, you know, his skeletons are showing. He's thin, he's scrawny, he's under a great burden, and the politician is fat and prosperous and rich, right? And Citizen Silva is the victim. But there's irony in that, because if you ask a politician that on his open day, when people come to meet him, what do they ask for? Over 90% ask for letters to get them jobs. People ask for help to get their kids into a school, all for undeserved or benefits that basically don't come out of going through the system in the proper way. Because they have come to understand that the politician is a kind of broker. Because in a country of broken institutions, the politician has become the broker that actually gets you access to the things that you want. And people have begun to accept that and actually function within that mindset. And even when you are electing people, you are not necessarily electing the guy who's going to reform the system, change the laws, and bring good governance. You're going to elect the guy who's going to help me, my family, my friends actually succeed in terms of our own desires for upward mobility. So you have a cynical, selfish voting mechanism or incentives that are set up. And I say that we can't have a democratic transition or hope to build a long-term future for Sri Lanka if this continues. And we have come to a very, one of those moments that can make the change. And I think there's a real question of whether we are going to squander that, whether we are going to just behave a little better while keeping the institutions still the same, and allow them to be eroded later on, or whether we are really going to make a change that can be entrenched. So if you look at countries that succeed in East Asia, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, at some point they have built institutions that can withstand political discretion and political interference. So you see the South Korean president facing impeachment over something because she gave her soothsayer astrologer access to documents. I mean, in Sri Lanka, this would be a joke. Of course, the astrologer must have access. How else do you do things that? So here are examples of countries that have been very much in the place that Sri Lanka was 20 years ago, and managed to change. And I think that the open question is Sri Lanka gearing itself up to make that change? And this is why, Miriam, I say that the overemphasis of or excessive focus on the peace-building agenda and the reconciliation agenda and losing sight of the institutional correction agenda can actually be dangerous for peace-building itself. So it's like, there's this whole theory that, political success comes from focusing on something other than political success. That you must care for something else more to get things that you want. So I think we have to be more ambitious about peace building. Not just about checking these boxes of transitional justice and reparation and accountability, but saying, do we have a system of institutions that can give justice overall to people? Because it is not just ethnic minorities that suffer the injustice of institutional decay in the country. So recently, Sri Lanka was before Geneva on the dock for torture complaints, 420 complaints of torture last year. The two areas of the country that had the highest reports of torture, one was in Anuradhapura, and the other was Mathura. Now, you could argue that Anuradhapura is because people in the north who suffer torture don't report it in the north, but come to Anuradhapura and report maybe. But Mathura is deep south, right? And that is the second highest reporting of torture in Sri Lanka. So the things that destroy the peace, and I think it is the problem of not having a state that is not responsive to you, that also inflames the identity politics in the country. Because when you can't get the state to deliver justice, law and order, economic prosperity and outcomes, the tendency for identity politics increase to grab the state through singleization, to separate from the state through Tamil nationalism, and create your own state. And we can't ignore that the causes of conflict also, and identity politics and ethno-centralization in the country, are to do with the failure of these institutions. So I'm saying, not to take anything away from what you're saying, but that our ambitions need to be stronger in terms of building a positive peace for the country.
Okay.
So I would absolutely agree with you on that. I do not want to say that the transitional justice process, the process of peace building, should be a separate enterprise. I think that's also part of the problem, and I think some of the box checking that's getting done, or that was also done by the previous regime. They had a beautiful spreadsheet of all the things that they were going to do, and they checked all those boxes. And so I think it cannot be kept separate from the issue, all the issues facing the entire country and those institutions. So I don't think we differ on that. I would say that part of the problem is that it is being treated as something over here. You see, that not something that affects the whole country. But, well, this is just, you know, we have to do this because Geneva is making us do it, or, you know, the international community is making us do it, and we'll do whatever it is that we have to do. But there's no buy-in from the rest of the country on this as being important or necessary or anything. And that partially comes into when you ask me what would healing look like. I think in terms of just basic groundwork, that there has to be an effort to address in particular the two completely different narratives that are held by the Tamils in the north and the Sinhalese in the south. I'm being very general here, okay? Because they're completely different. Now, why should the majority in the south care about going through this really difficult, painful process? They won the war. And they've been fed a narrative that their soldiers were heroes, and they were humanitarian heroes, and they saved the Tamils from these horrendous terrorists. That is what they've been then given, okay? So if you are going to begin to deal with this legacy, that is a huge sort of basic issue that you must address, and that requires courage and leadership from the top. And that is what I don't see. And I don't see how anything can succeed if you don't actually have that. If you start to slowly, obviously, it has to be over time, and it is a very uncomfortable subject, you know, to have to deal with. But that honesty and that courage has got to go into some type of a public awareness campaign or program or whatever to even begin to bring along the majority population. That's just absolutely a basic. I think that, you know, in this sort of our current environment of peace building and transitional justice experts, you know, lots of people want to go in and say, okay, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this, and it's all very nice and it's helpful, but I don't think it's necessarily the whole answer. And there has been a problem in terms of even the order of how things are going to be set up in these 4 different categories. And in fact, a lot of outside experts are arguing against the people in country who want things differently. And so I think, you know, that's also a problem. Whereas I agree with most of what you're saying in terms of this, the institutions being the basic problem for this kind of ongoing, really serious religious intolerance. And the ongoing, I would argue in terms of torture, perhaps Tamils are not going to report torture, period, in the north. They're just not going to report it. The ones who get out of the country are the ones who tend to report it. But it is a very serious issue. I would say it's not only a problem of the institutions and particularly the police, but it's political will as well. Because as Nishan says, you know, you can have all the laws and you can have all the regulations, but if there's no expectation that those laws have to be followed and consequences when they're not, then what is it's just so much writing on paper and so a nice constitution and that kind of thing.
So I'm going to put a pin in my thoughts and start collecting some questions. If I could ask you, I'll reach out to you, but if you could state your name and affiliation before asking a question. So, and then 1, 2, 3. We'll
Maria Rutas with people for the Lanka. Thank you. Just a few comments, and maybe Nishan can elaborate a bit more. As Miriam said, I think there's a qualitative difference to when, for example, using the torture example, when the torture isn't a problem across the island, but that in the south, for example, Sinhalese people or even Tamils get picked up for crimes and then they're tortured, whereas in the north, people are picked up randomly under the Counterterrorism Act and other things. So there is a difference. These people are tortured on the basis that they're Tamil. And I think on the positive peace building, the elections, President Sirisena and then the coalition with the support of the TNA, Tamil people voted for this. But they did vote for different reasons than the South. Tamil people voted on a platform of the Sirisena run coalition at the beginning, where we're talking about war crimes, accountability, and a political solution, and the TNA was supporting them. And those are the reasons that the Tamil people voted for them. So I think over the past 2 years, the government has failed to capitalize on the support that they had. For an example, on ethno-religious, I would challenge Nishan's point that it could be classed as a success, because while the state's jackboot might not be in it as much, the army is still involved in building Buddhist temples. Buddhist monks who've made death threats in recent weeks have not been arrested. The archaeological department and the forestry department is still involved in grabbing land of Tamil people's land for their own use. So the state is still very much involved in the singleization of the Northeast and other issues that Tamils keep raising. So why the army and the military and other state institutions keep maintaining, and take your point, institutionally there are challenges that need to be changed and it will take a lot of work. But over the past 2 years, how much has actually happened to address those issues? And without the Northeast, without the people in the Northeast, the Tamils in the Northeast having faith in this government, having the trust in this government, and I would argue divisions are actually deeper now than they were 2 years ago when people came out and voted for Sirisena, especially among civil society. I'm sure you know the perception of what change is and what change has happened is entirely different from when you go to the Northeast and the South. So I guess my question would be, what would you say, or in your engagement with the government, how could you challenge those perception differences that Miriam was talking about war crimes, about what federalism means in the constitution, and those sort of issues within the South are completely, you can't even mention or speak about those issues. Thank you.
we collect the questions. There might be overlap, and we can sort of maybe get to more.
Ananda Kumar, and I'm involved in Sri Lanka diaspora, but I'm involved in educational development work in Sri Lanka. So my observation is that from what both of you have said, there is a problem. I haven't, both of you have not addressed any, both of you have been fair in sharing your observations. There is a problem existing, and not a word about resolution. From the fact that Nishan's point that there is limited convergence and limited divergence, that is a weak, fragile government to even create an atmosphere of reconciliation and peace building in the infrastructure, and so let alone the constitutional change. Leave alone that. And in the recent 2 months, I have seen uprising of nationalistic feelings and violence in Jaffna University. Mahavira Nal, last week was celebrated. These are signs that there is failure from the infrastructure part. And given that situation, you both come from one is an advocacy and a civil society organization. I feel like when the elections were over 2 years ago, there was a lot of talk about that the civil society organizations have to own this problem, and we have to make a big difference. And my question is, what can we do as civil society organizations, as civilians who are genuinely interested in a change. Don't want to see another cycle of this 20-year cycle from 94 to 2014, another 20 years or 10-year cycle. We don't want to see. We want to see progress. What can we do, and what can we do to help you?
Hi, thank you very much. Tim Ryan from the Solidarity Center. I think that Nishan hit on a very important piece here. I don't want to make a long comment. I want to ask a four-part question in one question. You talked about economics. You talked about, even though I think in terms of institutional importance of institutions in places like Korea and Singapore, although I think that's a little bit like comparing pineapples and rambutans, but that's another story. So the real question is, what are the economic structures or facts on the ground or economic government policies, that are going to be either conducive to democratic change and equity or obstruct it? And of course, this is a huge issue when we think about issues like land and economic development in the North and East.
And so why don't we do these three questions, and you're going to be the first person we come back to, and then have straight answers. Does that sound good? Awesome.
So let me start by actually responding to Miriam, and I think I respond to some others at the same time, because Miriam raised a very important issue about building peace as being also a form of social conversion, that people had to understand the injustice that had happened, that Sinhala Sri Lankan society had to rethink the history of the war and the stories that they've been told and fed. And I've had the same dream and parked them to some extent in the last few years because I don't see a political leadership in Sri Lanka that is capable and able even. Not just willing, but also able to do that. Okay, so the real challenge is between conversion and containment. And what you found is that, especially the part of the even civil society that is concerned with the liberal peace idea it works on containment, not on conversion. All these groups that work in Colombo like to work on an elite consensus. So we call it the horizontal elite consensus rather than the vertical consensus. That is changing this mindset of society. Unfortunately for us, the people that are able to work on the vertical or social consensus tend to have ideas that don't fit the liberal peace model. And we've done an analysis of civil society in Sri Lanka in which we feel that there's a very, very significant distinction between the groups that can actually organize and mobilize at a mass level and those who can work at a constitutional technocratic level. And I think that's both a problem we are having in terms of civil society and political leadership. Now, if you like, there's something positive about the current government in that sense, that while the Prime Minister's side of the government is more on elite consensus, setting up constitutional changes and laws and structures, the President is much more a vertical consensus type of person. And the Prime Minister and the President have actually both put their, so which is why I'm saying today is still a great opportunity. And the most optimistic situation you find the President working quite hard towards that conversion. But he's working alone, and he's working against the odds that his own party might get split on this vertical conversion question, because the ex-president, also sitting inside his party, is working out a vertical consensus exactly in the opposite direction and gathering momentum. The president is challenging that. But to what extent will he have to barter his political capital or the ability to consolidate his party for the sake of moving the trying to move forward a vertical consensus in which he's competing with the enormously charismatic ex-president. And he's somewhat alone in that challenge, I would say. And yet, it is the first time that we have both attempts coming together. You had it for a while in President Chandrika Kumaratunga's government, where she had this thing called the Sudulelu movement, I think. And that was working on a vertical consensus, as well as she had others working on a new constitution. But that didn't also go the distance, ultimately. And it became easy to reverse both quite significantly. So today we have the elite consensus is actually quite strong on the reconciliation side on a new constitution. That goes at least maybe not the full distance, but 2/3 to 75% of the distance that Tamil politicians could want as their minimum. Okay. And still more than we've managed to achieve so far. So I think I think maybe Ananda's question is the question: why do the political establishment not have more help at this juncture? Is a very important question to address. Yeah.
Miriam?
That is a good question. I would say what I have seen happen in the relationship between civil society and the government has been a kind of, it's a very complex one. And so whereas civil society suddenly, was freer to express itself, it didn't have to worry, about sort of being picked up or disappearing or anything like that because of its work. What tended to happen is that, or what I have seen, is that civil society has been to some extent used by the government to contract out the things that they don't want to have to do themselves. And that refers a lot to the peace building. So this process of consultations with people about what this process should look like, it's completely being run by civil society. And so what's happened is that because civil society for so long was in opposition to the government, now they're having the opportunity to actually be part of it. So a lot of them, they are participating, but then the lines start getting blurred as to, are they still civil society or are they now quasi-governmental? And it's a messy line, and it's also created some divisions among different civil society groups, and particularly also, of course, as you say, there is a sort of a level of kind of elite technical type of civil society, and then much more the grassroots, and they don't always see eye to eye. So I would argue at least that they're being able to operate in a way that they couldn't before, but a lot could be improved upon in terms of the partnership. That that they keep their line of being civil society versus government, but that it's more of a partnership and not that things get farmed out to civil society in that sense. You were asking what could be done. I'm not sure of your situation, but you mentioned you were in education, and that's just, we haven't even opened up that whole issue, but it's one of the most important pieces of a society that's not going to go back into conflict. And it's not an area of my expertise, but I think if it is something that you're involved in, that I can't think of anything that would be more valuable than to work on that area of education. Sinhalese and Tamil and Muslim students, they learn different things. They do not have the same curriculum. And how is that going to contribute to a shared sense of identity and a sense of history for the future? So stop there.
I can't, oh, that thing that you said at the end. I'm just going to zip myself because we have index cards coming. But and,
So if I
and a
can
question,
just
yeah.
I think just to close this discussion, I think when I talked about the conversion of, I would want to say that the conversion is required not only of Sinhala society but also of Tamil society.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I think there's a danger of looking at the reconciliation process with where we prioritize the sense of victimhood and see Tamil people only as victims and Sinhala people only as oppressors. I think there's a wider space of victimhood than just Tamil people, and there's a wider space of oppression than just the Sinhalese people. And there's a lot that Tamil politics and Tamil society has to answer for. They have to answer to Muslims, they have to answer for, with regard to what happened to their own political leaders, and they have to answer to the kind of, virulent nationalist violence that has been actually championed as part of the ethnic struggle that is detrimental to peace building and needs to be addressed. So I think the question of justice is so important, and opening up a little bit. When we talk about the disappeared or mothers who've lost their children, these are on both sides of the divide. And I think peace building requires us to work on both sides like that. And there are some Tamil politicians working to really convert Tamil society and taking some political risks, and that is admirable. There are not enough Sinhala politicians, perhaps, who are taking those political risks that need to be done. Tim, coming to your question, there is, I've answered this question before by saying there are three things that are important in terms of the economy: jobs, jobs, and jobs. Okay?
So you said jobs?
Jobs. Not Steve Jobs, yeah. Really, it's amazing how most of the requests that politicians get are with regard to employment. If the South Korean embassy puts an advertisement saying they are recruiting people to South Korea, you get a line a mile long. Only 33% of Sri Lankan women are in the labor force in Sri Lanka, but at least about 15% are working outside the country. That means half of the women who want to work are probably working outside the country. We don't have good data, but these are estimates based on the fact that about 2 million people are working outside the country. So this is really, and majority of them are women. So there is a real crisis in people seeing themselves as having means of upward mobility in terms of the economy. And that is related to employment. But there are two other things. I don't want to trivialize it as just the employment issue, which means that we need a transition in the agriculture economy. 28% of Sri Lanka's workers present themselves as being mainly in agriculture. But agriculture, in terms of productivity, has about 1/5 the return to any service or industry. Okay, so 28% of the labor force in agriculture contributes about 9% of GDP. So the other sectors contribute much more. So it's always at levels of just sustainability or not even that. And normally people in agriculture do other jobs to actually make a living and survive. So transforming the agriculture economy, which Vietnam, Cambodia, South Korea, everybody has worked on to do, in order to bring people in agriculture into the middle class. And farmers need to become savers. And people who can contribute to saving and farming needs to become something that is profitable, which it isn't in Sri Lanka at the moment. That's a huge issue. The structure of education also needs to change. There is a high desire for education in universities. The spots are very few. And it is not clear that university education, except in a few departments and areas, is adequately gearing people to function and succeed economically in terms of building the kind of problem-solving skills, the critical thinking skills, the management skills, the people skills. In Sri Lanka, when people talk about soft skills, they think it's English and IT. Actually, soft skills are about being able to relate and work with other people well, which is so fundamental to succeeding in any endeavor.
Like the Bhutanese model.
Pardon?
Sorry, like the Bhutanese
The
model. I was
Bhutanese
just,
model,
yeah.
So I think the education, and we have a huge issue in Sri Lanka, which, South Asia itself, the lack of dignity of labor, of blue-collar labor. So everybody wants to get out of being a the estate worker, out of being a carpenter, being a plumber. People don't have a sense of dignity in their work, and succeeding is getting to white collar jobs. But which economy survives on everybody having white collar jobs? Right. So until we can have a transformation also in the way labor aspirations are built and rewarded, I think, and how educational opportunities and funneling of people into skills works to make that happen, we have a very serious structural problem for the economy. So both in the education, agriculture, and employment opportunities, I think that these are not just problems that can be solved in a day, because they're structural problems that need taking on fundamentally from now on with a long-term plan if Sri Lanka is going to succeed.
And that's a nice positive note for us too. So can we get the gentleman at the back who has waited very patiently? And then I have 3 questions from the audience here.
Hello there. I've got a quick question about the economy. So under Yahapalana, what was the sort of economic reforms that was sort of put forward, and how far has that sort of gone since then? And is there any sort of forces that are sort of stopping it from going forward, or is that does these reforms have the support of the government and the people? Thanks.
Thank you. And do we have any other questions from the audience that we can take? Let's get that one.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Schmidt. I'm with International Development Group. And I wanted to come back to the question of creating trust, because I think long term, something like education is a great way to do that. But in terms of breaking this cycle, this 20-year cycle of democratization, coming back to it over and over again, what are some ways to get a quick win, to start building trust? What's the entry point for programming policy, things like that?
And then can I quickly read out the questions, the 3 other questions we have from the audience? And I'll editorialize a bit in the interest of time. Or read at fast South Asian style. So in regards to the weakness of institutions in Sri Lanka, there are similar weaknesses in corruption in the police department in the US, racism, brutality, etc. Democracy is already developed in the US, but there's still major institutional corruption. What are the steps that you believe that an institution can take in developing and developed countries to strengthen their institutions? The second question is, what real role will the new constitution play if or when it comes to fruition? And the third question is, how is the government handling and preventing Islamic extremism and other forms of extremism? Thinking about, is Islamic extremism a threat to peace building? So, bullet points. Miriam, do you want to go first this time?
Okay.
Yeah.
So on trust, that could be a whole subject for a panel. But the types of trust building actions that the government could take in terms of the North and East have been repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated, and they're no secret. One of them is reducing the level of militarization in that area, releasing or charging the list of political prisoners who have been detained, some of them for many, many years, speeding up the return of land, reducing, this was actually said by the foreign minister very shortly after the election said that the military is going to return to barracks. They're not going to be involved in businesses anymore. That's not the case. They're heavily involved in businesses. in the North and East, including the tourist economy. So there could be changes made there. So there's just a whole host of things that they could do to show, to try to gain some trust from the people. And so that's not rocket science. So I would answer that there. The question about the Constitution, could you just quickly?
So what real role will the new constitution play if or when it comes to fruition?
So the real role, I think the idea, and Nishan, please chime in, is that coming up with a new constitution is a way to address, for the future, kind of non-recurrence of conflict. Can we, in our constitution, establish safeguards and rights for all Sri Lankans equally as a way of preventing conflict in the future? It's kind of traveling on a parallel track to the transitional justice process, but in some ways I think that the constitutional initiative has moved forward more. And it's now, I think the idea is that in 2017, next year, it actually will get voted on in Parliament, and then it's going to have to be put to a referendum of the people. So that's what I would say there. And then I would, I'll leave some of the others, but I just wanted to add to Nishan's discussion about jobs, the job sector, the agriculture, et cetera, just to add to what he's already said, that in terms of the North and the East, you have to also take into account that the sort of the economic level is so much lower, that you also have a majority of female-headed households, and that the issue of just plain livelihood is really paramount. And then again, as I mentioned, those military businesses, they do cut into a lot of the possibilities for work for the people there. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Definitely not me.
Lots of questions. I'm trying to figure out here. Let me, I think if I can leave the trust question to Miriam and take the institutions, about the US also having institutions that do bad things. I'm not talking about the existence of abuse within institutions. I'm really talking about the way that institutions don't exist, in the sense that there's so much political discretion in the functioning and actions that institutions take that you can't really call them institutions. And there's no remedy for their bad behavior. When I was 12 years old, I watched from my balcony every single Tamil home around me, I lived in a Tamil area, being looted and burnt down by mobs. It was one thing to watch that happening around me and watch every single house being burned down and my Tamil neighbors, running in fear for sanctuary all around me, quite a lot in our house. But it's another thing to see the police and the army standing amongst the mobs and managing that violence without stopping it. So there were certain limits they placed on it, but a lot of limits that they did not place on it. So burning and looting was allowed, but outright murder, maybe not. Right? And the Ramakrishna Mission, which is a Hindu kind of religious place opposite my house, that was protected, but Tamil homes were not. Single houses were protected until the police found out we had Tamil people in our house. Then we were told we were not protected either. But until then, we were. So they became, for me, an example of how the state apparatus colludes in the violence. And you can't really call that an institution anymore when there has absolutely been no remedy to that. No action that has ever been taken to say, how did that ever happen? How do we hold the police and the military accountable for what happened? So I think that, and the reason is that ever since independence, every government of Sri Lanka has used violence as a means of governance. when Tamil riots in 1956 were put down by thugs, but every single opposition to government is put down by a group of people who attack them and the police and military standing by. So violence as an instrument of governance has been normal and prevalent.
Normalized, yeah.
But now that kind of open, ugly violence, like snatching people off in white vans, beating them up on the streets, that's not so okay because the world and the environment of scrutiny has changed. But now we use violence through a mechanism of laws. So if you look at the way the government is trying to change the criminal procedure code, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the new counterterrorism laws, they have laws that say that if you do anything that undermine the unity of the country, that you can be put in jail and taken away. Now the word, it's not even national unity. Anything that causes a problem to unity. I mean, these are absurd laws. And this is why at Tissanayagam, all the journalists we know in the past, and routinely, these laws that are about counterterrorism are used against political opponents or people that you don't like or want to silence, or the media. So I think this is the problem of institutions that we have to really take on, because as long as we allow governance to be arbitered through systems of violence, and that is so attractive when you have political power, which explains why it's being done even today, right? Because it's so convenient to govern that way, it's so much simpler.
Can I just, I mean, and I think it's so challenging primarily because you're looking at a post-conflict environment where the police and the military had a very different role to play for decades and decades, and now it's sort of, well, it's normalized, but clearly there's a history of how they've interacted with the people. So that goes back to the trust element that we've kind of talked about. Right?
I'm saying that it is even
Beyond
prior to
that.
post-conflict.
Okay.
It is prior to the conflict itself. It's
So
the 70s,
post-independence.
it's the 60s. It's a post-independence problem of Sri Lanka that we haven't adequately recognized. The new constitution, I think, needs to deliver a symbolic win to Tamil moderate politics. And that is the worry that I have. That Tamil moderate, so Tamil politicians are also fighting the tendency for extremism. So if I had to answer the Islamic extremism question prior, I would say the problem in Sri Lanka is not Islamic extremism. It's extremism of the other two communities in Sri Lanka, right? So we shouldn't, make Islamic extremism the big bugbear of the world. And also we must understand that what we call religious extremism or ethnic extremism is often a political movement that is using the identity politics of religion and ethnicity in order to vent itself. And we must take the political concern seriously without labeling it as something to be dismissed or that cannot be negotiated with or cannot be engaged with. And so we need to be very careful in doing that. So I think the Constitution, if it can't deliver a symbolic win to moderate Tamil politics, what you will find is that the more extreme sort of Tamil politics that is not in favor of the moderate leadership will gain an upper hand. Usually extremist groups, so to speak, I don't like that word, but I'm using it, feed on each other, right? So that helps Sinhala nationalist groups also to organize and say, look, you offered them an inch, they're asking for a yard, we told you so, and we cycle back to a kind of a square one in setting up ethnic polarizations once again. So what the new constitution delivers can be quite important, but on the positive side, some of the most important changes we may get may come outside of the things we are focused on. They may come out from the new parliamentary oversight committees that have come out quietly under the radar, but have enormous capacity to hold public, services and the public sector accountable. They may come out of the RTI legislation that has passed that will eventually have to get implemented and force government to open up information, not be so secretive and reveal what it's doing. And we may have to look at instrumentalizing those opportunities rather than place all the eggs in the basket of this new constitution that's going to come and save us. So there is no savior in the new constitution alone. It is always going to disappoint at all ends in some fashion. And last year I talked about equilibrium of mutual discontent. And I think that is all that is potentially possible at a constitutional or legislative level. But I think, groups of people that are kind of working um, with a sense of vision and purpose to use the opportunities that exist to change the functioning and change the accountability of government to citizens. Yeah. Because the lack of accountability, I think, is the gravest, undermining factor. That politicians and institutions and public office officials can do things and get away with it, and people don't know what they do, and there's no answerability. When that changes, when the Sri Lankan public and society is animated enough to demand answerability and demand accountability in a more sustained way that creates political costs for not giving that, then I think we begin to see the kind of change that we need to sustain the democratic transition in Sri Lanka. Our work with SIPE actually has demonstrated that quite well, that it is not by lobbying or going behind the back, behind politicians or talking to friends in power that we get change, but actually by going public and creating questions about why things haven't been solved that can be solved, why things that can improve economic outcomes are not being done, and the public questioning and presentation of reasonable arguments is what we have seen as the greatest kind of agent of change, and in a much more sustainable way than the fact that my friend is the prime minister or the other method of civil society influence that is very popular in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, I don't know, for me it was refreshing to not, thank you both, and I think thank you for your questions, because it really helped us unpack what's at hand. And while we might have been talking about pessimistic things, I think that was very optimistic. It was hard for me to not have my phone to tweet things. I want to thank SIPE for hosting us today. And,
thank you very much. Really, what a fantastic program. Ashley and Julie and Ken from the communications department, thank you very, very much for organizing this. Jenny, as usual, what an amazing job. Thank you. And I introduce you to Mark, who heads the South Asia, Europe, and Eurasia department. But I also want to introduce you to our boss, everybody, Andrew Wilson, our managing director, who's been here listening very carefully. On behalf of everybody at SIPE, Kiran, Nishan, Miriam, what a fantastic, fantastic session. So on behalf of everybody, thank you very, very much. It was a great job. Thank you.